False and True Humour by Joseph Addison. Risu inepto, res ineptior nulla est. Nothing is more foolish when a laugh out of place. Among all kinds of writing, there's none in which authors are more apt to miscarry than in works of humour, as there's none in which they are more ambitious to excel. It is not an imagination with teems of monsters, a head that is filled with extravagant conceptions, which is capable of furnishing the world with diversions of its nature, and yet if we look into the productions of several writers who set up a Men of Humour, what wild irregular fancies, what unnatural distortion of thoughts do we meet with? If we speak nonsense, we believe they are talking humour, and when they have drawn together a scheme of absurd, inconsistent ideas, they are not able to read it over to themselves without laughing. These poor gentlemen endeavour to gain themselves a reputation of wits and humorists by such monstrous conceits as almost qualify them for Bedlam, not considering that humour should always lie under the check of reason, and that it requires the direction of a nice judgment by so much the more as it includes in self and the most boundless freedoms. There is a kind of nature that is to be observed in this sort of composition as well as in all other, and a certain regularity of thoughts which must discover the writer to be a man of sense, at the same time that he appears altogether given up to caprice. For my part, when I read the glorious mirth of an unskilful author, I cannot be so barbarous as to divert myself with it, but am rather apt to pity the man than to laugh at anything he writes. The decent Mr. Shadwell, who had himself a great deal of a talent which I am treating of, represents an empty rake, and one of his plays is very much surprised to hear one say that breaking of windows was not humour, and I question not but several English readers will be as much startled to hear me affirm that many of those raving, incoherent pieces, which are often spread amongst us under odd Chymerical Titles, are rather the offspring of a distempered brain than works of humour. It is indeed much easier to describe what is not humour than what is, and very difficult to define it otherwise when as Coley has done wit, by negatives. Where I give my own notation of it, I would deliver them after Plato's manner in a kind of allegory, and, by supposing humour to be a person, deduce to him all his qualifications according to the following gallogy. Truth was the founder of a family, the father of good sense. Good sense was the father of wit, who married a lady of Collateral Line called Mirth, but whom he had issued humour. Humour, therefore, being the youngest of his illustrious family, and is scant for parents of such different dispositions, as very various and unequal in his temper. Sometimes you see him putting on grave looks and solemn habit, sometimes airy in his behaviour and fantastic in his dress, insomuch that at different times he appears as serious as a judge and as jocular as a merry Andrew. But as he has a great deal of a mother in his constitution, whatever mood he is in, he never fails to make his company laugh. But since there is an impostor abroad who takes upon him the name of his young gentleman, he would willingly pass for him in a word. The end with well-meaning person may not be imposed upon by cheats. I would desire my readers, when they meet with this pretender, to look into his parentage and examine him strictly, when or not he be remotely allied to truth, and lightly discount from good sense. If not, they may conclude it him a counterfeit. They may likewise distinguish him by a loud and excessive laughter, in which he seldom gets his company to join with him, for his true humour generally looks seriously, whilst everybody laughs about him. False humour is always laughing, whilst everybody about him looks seriously. I shall only add, if he has not in him a mixture of both parents, that is, if he would pass for the offspring of wit without mirth, or mirth without wit, you may conclude him to be altogether surprisingly and a cheat. The impostor of whom I am speaking descends originally from Falsehood, who was a mother of nonsense, who was brought to bed of a so-called frenzy, who married one of the daughters of Folly, commonly known by the name of Laugher, on whom he begot that monstrous infant of which I have been here speaking. I shall set down at length the genealogy table of false humour, and, at the same time, place under it the genealogy of true humour, that the reader may at one view behold the different spirits and relations. Falsehood, nonsense, frenzy, laugher, false humour, truth, good sense, wit, mirth, humour. I might extend the allegory by mentioning several of the children of false humour, who are more in number than the sand of sea, and might in particular enumerate by many sons and daughters which he has begot in this island. But as this would be very interesting task, I shall only observe in general that false humour differs from the true, as the monkey does from first of all. He is exceedingly given to little apish tricks and buffooneries. Secondly, he so much delights in mockery that is all on to him, whether he exposed by it vice and folly, luxury and errands, or, on the contrary, virtue and wisdom, pain and poverty. Thirdly, he is wonderful unlucky in so much that he will bite the hand that feeds him, and endeavour will dickle both friends and foes indifferently. For having but small talents, he must be merry where he can, not where he should. Fourthly, being entirely void of reason, he pursues no point either of morally or instruction, but ingloriously only for the sake of being so. Fifthly, being inexcapable of anything but mock representations, his ridicule is always personal and aimed at the rigorous man of a writer, not at the vice or at the writing. I have here only pointed at the whole species of false humorist, but as one of my principal designs in this paper is to beat down the malignant spirit which discovers itself in the writing of a present age. I shall not scruple for the future to single out any of the small wits that infest the world with such compositions as are ill-natured, immoral, and absurd. This is the only exception which I shall make to the general rule I have recited myself, of attraction multitudes. Since every honest man ought to look upon himself as in nature's state of war with the libeller and lupuna, and to any one in whatever way falls in this way, this is but retaliation upon them, and treating them as they treat others.